Hello, this is the US Futures weekly chart analysis for the week ending 21st of October 2022. The first chart's the US dollar index. We saw supply drawn out of the market on this bar, and we suspected supply was being drawn out 2 weeks later. I'll just put the lines in quickly. This week, price has attempted to push higher just briefly, but it's failed, and price has moved lower in response. It hasn't really moved below the low of the previous bar, but there's been an increase in volume, an increase in spread towards the downside. This suggests that supply continues to be drawn out just below the 115 level. It's looking more like price may need to come back and test the 110 level for strength. We'll have to wait and see. Price didn't close significantly below the previous bar's low, so there has been an attempt to absorb the supply being drawn out in this bar, despite the spread being slightly wider than the previous bar. But the higher volume, with price moving down, does show that supply is being drawn out and the market's attempting to absorb it. So we'll just have to see how it plays out early next week. Almost certainly early next week, price will move a little lower in response, and then we'll see what happens from there. It'll pretty much depend on how much supply is drawn out as price dips lower early next week. The next chart is the E-mini S&P. This is the S&P 500 index futures. The more recent lows are here, around the 3,600. The previous low is a bit further back at this level. US dollar index was lower this week, which allowed this market to push higher. There was some buying in the previous bar. There was uncertainty as well. The close off the low suggests that some buying, perhaps speculative, came in. Spread and volume were both a little above average, so that was probably a pretty good response overall. It's actually looking a little bit more promising at this level right at this point. Price hasn't broken down. It's had the opportunity to do so, and there is an attempt to push higher. I'm not sure it's going a long way at the moment. You have a level just through here that'll probably offer some sort of resistance with the congestion in this level here. There's a little bit more room to move if it chooses to go higher next week, and we'll see what happens if price does get up to this level, about 39,000. Next chart is the 10-year note futures. They've been drifting lower for quite some time now, and prices closed below the previous bar's low again. Spread increased on reduced volume, so a little bit more volatility came into the market this week. There is a close off the low, so some speculative buying may have been drawn out. We'll just have to see. You might get a little response next week, at least early, that looks a little like this. Whether that can be maintained, we'll have to wait and see. You have to remember that the opportunity to move higher was offered this week with the US dollar index moving lower, and this market was not able to move higher in response. So there is an underlying weakness in this market, despite the opportunity to move higher this week. Copper price futures. Copper price futures have been very resilient recently, attempting to absorb the strength in the US dollar, and have done a really good job in doing that so far. Price really should have been stretching lower, looking for buyers, and it's maintained this level despite the US dollar moving higher over that period. So it's a really good response, a strong response, and when markets free up a little, or if the US dollar starts to ease lower and perhaps tests that 110 level for strength, this market will have the opportunity to move higher. Gold price futures. Gold price futures have been attempting to absorb the strength in the US dollar in a similar way to the copper price futures. It hasn't been quite as strong, as that market, but it's doing a pretty good job as well. There was testing for supply this week below the previous bar's close, and volume was about average, so there was still some supply drawn out, as there was in the lows of this bar. So it wasn't really low supply, which would have allowed the market to move higher with much more ease. But if the US dollar does come back and test that 110 level for strength, I expect that price will attempt to move higher. How much it's got in it will be debatable at the moment, and there's certainly going to be some increased resistance at the 1700 level now. This will cause issues, at least in the near term. Silver price futures closed higher this week, as they should have done, considering the weakness in the US dollar. Here's the highs of the range. Here's the previous breakdown line. It's going to form a little zone. And here's the breakdown line prior to that, where there'll be further resistance. So you've got resistance expected at 22 and 20 and a half through here. So price has some room to move up to 20 and a half. And this market does have some previous buying in the background. Whether that's been retained or not, uncertain. There was buying in here. The positive response pretty much confirmed it. There was a little pullback, acceleration higher. And that bar, if you want to draw it in to make the chart look a little more clear, looks more like this. Price has tested $18 again, and it's responded positively this week with the tailwind offered by the US dollar index. So there is an opportunity to move higher, particularly if the US dollar does move lower this week. Light crude futures have been trading inconsistently, is probably the nicest way of putting it. It hasn't been particularly easy to read, and it hasn't done exactly what's been expected at this point in time, at least not always. But there was a push lower, a breakdown out of this zone, and it wasn't supported. Some buying supports come in. That was confirmed by a pushback up to the lows of the old trading range, where you would expect resistance to have formed now. In response, price pulled back, but with a reduced spread and almost the same volume. So there was an attempt to support the market and absorb the supply being drawn out. And this week has done exactly the same. Volume was very slightly lower. Spread narrowed considerably and closed in the middle. This was an attempt to absorb supply in preparation for another attempt to push higher, probably a challenge to this level at some point in the future. So this was an absorption bar. This was the market attempting to absorb the supply being drawn out, which will offer another opportunity for price to move higher when trading conditions are more favourable, and perhaps issue a challenge to the previous highs, which are here, and the lows of the old trading range. So I'm expecting a bar sort of like this next week. It may have a little dip below the previous close to test for supply early, and then you'll get a bar something like this. That's what the expectation would be. I have to say this market hasn't really responded perfectly as you might expect at times more recently. So we'll just have to see what we get. But that would be the expectation. A little test for supply very early next week below the previous close. And if supply is found to be low, an attempt to push higher and perhaps challenge the lows of the trading range and the recent high up here, which are pretty much the same level. Aussie dollar currency futures. Here was the breakdown, attempt to hold on and break down at the 70-cent level. And there was another level around the 68 cents, which wasn't able to hold. There was a brief attempt to hold it, but wasn't able to hold. Price sliced lower. And really, I expected a decent attempt to hold 65, but that was just taken out. I anticipated that would be stronger than the 68 level, and the 68 level actually made an attempt to hold where there was hardly anything offered at the 65 level. Such was the strength of the US dollar at the time. Price has, however, attempted to come back, and it's trying to challenge the lows of this little range. I expect that there'll be increased resistance and selling pressure, which will emerge mostly out of this little bit of congestion here. It's not a lot, so there is the opportunity to move higher. It will take an extra effort, which will probably be reflected in volume. You can see volume was lower this week. That would have reflected reduced selling pressure and allowed the market to float up higher. That means there wasn't a great deal of intent behind the price movement higher, and it was a weak or soft attempt to move higher. It's not a serious attempt, and that's probably why it stalled out at the lows of this bar and the lows of this little range. It will need some real effort to be put in if it's going to move above those levels and push back up towards the 65. I'm not sure that this market is strong enough to do it, and perhaps it'll move lower in response. But I'm always prepared to be surprised. The opportunity is there for the market to push back through the lows of the old trading range and up towards 65 if it's strong enough. Bitcoin futures. This sideways action is perhaps going on a little longer than I'd be comfortable with. We'll have to wait and see what actually happens in the end. I've been suggesting that there's been more buying than selling within this zone, or the buyers are at least holding the upper hand, but the price is just going nowhere at the moment, and perhaps that's part of the tactic. Just wait for markets to be more favourable, and in the meantime, you can wait out the turmoil in the general markets and the strength in the US dollar. We'll just have to wait and see. I wouldn't be buying this until I see which way price breaks, because whichever way price breaks, the strength that's been generated within this zone will support the price movement, whichever way price moves. So if price moves higher and attempts to break out, this strength that's been built up in here will support the breakout. But if price breaks down and heads down towards the 10,000 level, then I expect that the buying that's been found in this zone will be dumped, and that will support the price moving lower and really overwhelm any buyers that attempt to stand in its way until it gets down to the next level, which I anticipate is between 8,000 and 12,000, and we're calling 10,000 the middle of the range. It's going on a little bit longer than I'd like. An accumulation like this would normally last 12 to 16 weeks, 3 to 4 months, and it's getting on towards 5 months now. It's a little bit long-winded, and you have to wonder whether sentiment's changing from what it originally was to where it is now. Otherwise, the market would have made some attempt to move, either higher or lower. At the moment, it's just going sideways with very narrow spreads on mostly average volumes. This week, volume was much lower, so activity in the market was much lower. There was no effort or force behind this week's trading. So we'll just have to see how it responds. Back to the US dollar index, just quickly. Put the lines in so you can see how the market's been trading. Definitely had supply drawn out of the market and into this bar, which pushed it lower. That's why there was the low close. Price attempted to move higher after a test for supply or mini shakeout even on this bar, and spread was very narrow on well above average volume. That was supply being drawn out and keeping this bar really narrow. In response, price has moved lower. It hasn't moved significantly below the previous bar's low, so it's really not that weak, and it suggests there's an attempt to absorb supply. Volume was increased and considerably above average, so there was a lot of activity in this bar. There's a lot going on, and if there is an attempt to move higher, you'll probably see a test for supply early next week. And then if supply is low, an attempt to move higher. But if supply continues to be drawn out, you may see price attempt to move even lower and challenge those sellers further, which would mean a test of the 110 level becoming more and more likely. Okay. Thanks for your time. Hopefully that was worthwhile watching. Thanks again. See ya.